Hey, what's up guys, and by the end of this video you'll be able to understand what manual mode is and you'll be shooting in it in no time. Every lens has aperture blades, and aperture blades determine how much light goes through your lens and enters on your camera's sensor. This is shown for the f-stop. The lower the f-stop, more light gets let into your lens because the aperture blades are wide and open. When the aperture blades are wide open, it allows for a more shallow depth of field, which means you can get that creamy bokeh in the background of your images. This is perfect if you're a portrait photographer because you want the viewer to only focus in on the subject that you're trying to shoot. So the lower the f-stop you go, the more of that background gets killed off. However though, if you're a landscape photographer, you're going to want to use a higher f-stop. This makes the aperture blades go really small, which lets in a lot less light. However, it makes more things in focus in your frame. So if you're going to shoot landscapes, you're going to want a higher f-stop as you're trying to capture the whole scene instead of just one subject. Because their aperture blades are really small now, this is going to cause for a lot less light to go through the lens and hit the sensor. This is where the second major setting comes into play, shutter speed. This is where you're going to have to lower your shutter speed to such as 1/13 of a second, maybe even lower. This is so you can counteract the amount of light that's coming in through your lens and onto your camera sensor. The lower the shutter speed you have, obviously takes less time for your camera to actually take the photo, and the faster it is, the shorter time, which means it only has a short window to let in more light. So this is why landscape photographers have to lower the shutter speed, because they haven't got that light coming through the aperture blades because it's so small. However, having a shutter speed at like 1/13 of a second, it's impossible for the human to keep your hand still for that long of a time, which means it's going to cause some motion blur. This is why you're going to see landscape photographers use a tripod every time they go out. This is so the camera's completely still and you can still capture the frame without having any motion blur. But if you're going to be a sports photographer or a wildlife photographer, you're going to need a fast shutter speed because you really want to freeze that motion from when either the player's running down the line or if a bird's flying in the air. You don't want the bird or the player to be really blurry, so you're going to want to freeze that motion in place so when you capture the photo everything is completely still. This way you have to counteract it again and use a lower f-stop to make them aperture blades wide and open even more to let in the light that way. This way also kills off the background because it gets in a lot more bokeh as you're using a lower f-stop. See, this is why with manual each different setting comes into play with each other and helps each other to make sure you capture the perfect image and expose the scene correctly. Think about it, 1/4000th of a second, it's really quick. You're going to need to get some light from somewhere, and that's either by opening the aperture blades, by lowering the f-stop to let in more light that way, or you might have to up the ISO, which digitally brightens up your image. So now you could just say, so why didn't you up your ISO if you're a landscape photographer to make the image brighter? Well, that way, if you're really using a high f-stop, such as like f14, then it's going to be really dark. So if you up your ISO to counteract that while having just say 1/100th of a second shutter speed, then you're going to have a lot higher ISO, such as maybe even a couple thousand ISO, and then this causes your image to be really noisy and really grainy. Some people like this style because it might give it the old film look. However, in reality, you're going to want as low ISO as you can to avoid your image being really noisy and grainy. This is why landscape photographers try and reduce the amount of ISO as they can by using a tripod and just lowering the shutter speed, because you get a better image quality that way. If you are a sports photographer, you are going to have to up the ISO a little bit to make sure you're getting some light from somewhere. This is why you see a lot of photographers use full frame cameras, because full frame cameras are a lot better in low light, and this is why you see them using that massive, let's say 400mm f2 or 200mm f2, because the f2, the lower the f-stop, the wider the aperture blades go to let in that light. So this is why they're trying to reduce the amount of ISO they need by getting this expensive lens that gets the reach and opens up widely as well. The good term for when you're learning manual, it's all called the exposure triangle. If you learn the exposure triangle, I guarantee your photography will improve so much more and you'll have way more control over the scene. To help you see the image is exposed perfectly, there's a setting on the camera called the exposure compensation meter. This shows how perfect the exposure frame is or how many stops of light you're under or overexposed. If you look at this graph and it's down by 2 stops of light, that means you're really underexposed, so you need to find 2 more stops of light to make your frame exposed perfectly. This means you might have to lower your shutter speed a bit to let in more light, up the ISO, or lower the f-stop. However, if it's way up to the right and you're overexposed by 2 stops, this means you either have to up your shutter speed or lower your ISO to allow less light to come into your frame. And now the 5th thing that's important for when you're trying to expose your scene perfectly is the histogram. The histogram tells you your blacks, your shadows, your highlights and your whites. And if it's all up on one side, that means your whites are completely crushed and you can't get any detail back. Or if they're all the way back down to the other side, that means your blacks can't be recovered and you can't see anything because there's no detail in the shadows. So by looking at the histogram, you're really going to want to try and get it all equally in the middle. So when you do go to post-process your images in Lightroom, for example, you're going to have way more room to recover the highlights and the shadows when you edit your photos, because you've looked at the histogram and you've looked at the exposure compensation meter and you've got all your settings that you want, and you know that your frame is going to be perfectly exposed, so you don't have to worry about it in post. I promise you, if you learn manual mode, your photography improves so much because you can control the scene, you know how to capture motion, you know how to get that blurry background, and you know to try and reduce the amount of ISO as you can by looking at the exposure compensation meter and the histogram to help you expose the frame perfectly. I guarantee you'll get so many more better photos and you'll just keep improving as you go on. So thanks for so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed and I really hope it helped you out. Leave a comment below if this did help you out. I really hope it did. So if you enjoyed, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to see more. Thank you very much and I'll see you on the next episode.